I think that was, I'm sure the audience will agree with me, extremely insightful, presentations by all three speakers. And I'm very happy to see also that there were some disagreements and expressed very articulately, both with respect to whether India should be even getting involved in this, and then of course relating to the first question itself as to the dynamics of the conflict. So I just want to actually just throw it out to the audience now, because I know you guys have been patiently sitting, listening to these views. So perhaps you can use that mic over here. I'll just use this wireless one. Yeah. So does anyone have any questions or any comments that they'd like to say, please?
We really haven't had a chance to listen to a totally pure Iranian view of the whole thing. So. I think one very important country that we've not really talked about in this whole thing is the US, and how the US is playing its game in every part of the world, and including this, So I think for India, it's a very tightrope walk to take a clear stand on anything. But yeah, I agree that it needs to have a clear, a strong foreign policy. Foreign policy, I believe in India, is not taken very seriously in terms of the politicians. They don't actually really. They are more involved in pleasing their own vote banks, and how, if at all, some foreign policy initiative affects that, then they take a stand. Otherwise, they just don't bother.
Sure, thank you. Maybe we can ask whoever wants to take this, and maybe starting with Shimon, on the role of the US, because I think that is a good point. We talked.
I would like to also add one more thing. Mir Dagan just recently gave a very rarest of the rare interviews. He didn't give any interview in the past 10 years. And he actually said on that interview that the Iranian regime right now is a liberal regime. I think it's a very important thing. Mir Dagan was the chief of the Mossad for the last 10 years. And a chief of the Mossad saying such a thing, it's a very important thing. If he thinks that the Iranian regime is liberal. Sure. And he also thinks that there is no reason to bomb Iran. So I think it's a very important
So maybe if I can
thing.
just take that question and put it in a more focused way to Shimon, and also linking it to what Mihir was saying about, how does Israel see, I mean, obviously they're very close allies, but how do you see that, the role of America in the region, given its relationship with Iran and Israel? Because obviously that's the most powerful country. So ideally, it would have a role in, creating peace. But here, obviously, it's a one-sided situation. So what is your take on that?
About the US, I think America is no different from any other member of the international community in terms of the role they should play and in terms of the interests in which they are invested. I don't think, it's not a question of the US and Iran. It's so many other countries are in the same position, that the world system as it is would be a much more dangerous, a much more bloody place if Iran had nuclear weapons. Mihir's oil prices would not be as low as he wishes them to be the morning after. So I think the US, just like any other country, has an interest to change that. But I don't see a special rule for America at all. I don't think it's their thing more than it is the thing of the French or the Moroccans or the Chinese or the South Koreans. I don't think there's any special role. About the gun, he said two things. I think he's probably misquoted. It's impossible that he said that it's a liberal society. And if he did, then I'm worried that he would, if he said that, then I'm worried that he was ending our intelligence service, because a liberal society is a country like India, where you can go to India Gate and light a candle and say our government is corrupt and needs to change, and go home and nothing will happen to you. I don't think that's the case in Iran. About bombing Iran, he said it's a stupid idea. And I'm intentionally not putting myself now in this argument between, you know, our ex-head of intelligence and our prime minister and our head of the army. I'm not getting into that now. It wasn't part of my presentation. It's.
Okay. Well, it's a good point you made about the Indian foreign policy and how it actually caters so much to the domestic polity. And Mihir also made a point about how we are late in our foreign policy. Let me take the clock back over here. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, India did not condemn Iraq till the very end. It waited till all its citizens were evacuated before it condemned. The same thing happened in Libya as well. So you have your own domestic compulsions. And this is very rare for me. I'm actually going to be devil's advocate and actually defend the Indian foreign policy for a change. And you have to understand that the Indian Foreign Service is extremely understaffed. It's extremely understaffed. They're working with very limited resources, and they're looking at a very, very complex region. For India, when it looks at West Asia, and that's what, as a scholar on West Asia, when I started looking at it, there were only two things we looked at it over there. We looked at it as the home of Islam, and so we have those cultural affinity and importance attached to it. And second, of course, is the energy tie, which Mihir again spoke about how energy. But it's in a certain way, you're overstating the importance of Iran in our energy security, because there are more important countries, which, for example, Japan and Sri Lanka, which import more Iranian oil than we do. And yet they were willing to come on board and actually find alternative sources for energy sources. We have started for a change to look at Iran as a bridge to Central Asia and as a counterweight to Pakistan. But you see, this is the problem, and this is the thing which I said again. Our bilateral relationship with Iran is nothing to do with the bilateral factors. It's got completely to do with how we see Iran as a tool to another country. And similarly, Iran sees us as a tool to another, as a wider, grandiose strategy, which is where I again re-emphasize my point that India and Iran relations are good on paper. They're good in photo op and photo shoot opportunities, but when it comes to the geostrategic, actual bilateral energy and otherwise, it is not where it stands. Thanks.
Am I allowed to be controversial? Absolutely. Okay. They express themselves very subtly, very elegantly, in a very nuanced way. Hum to seedhe baat karte hain. So let me ask you something, Sidha Bhat. You said, in my blunt understanding, we have a Muslim minority in India who feels positive emotions towards Iran because Iran is a Muslim country, and that should shape our stance towards Iran. Would you say the same thing about Pakistan? If not, then what's the difference?
I don't think any Indian Muslim, or even a large proportion of Indian Muslims right now, would have a friendly feeling about Pakistan. And if they did, it would be reflected in our foreign policy. However, a large proportion of Shias everywhere and a large proportion of people who are not Muslim but partake in the Mughalized, Khatri, North Indian culture of kebabs, qawwalis, Kathak. For us, Iran is a civilizational home. What I am wearing comes from somewhere. I wear this every day. I haven't worn this specifically today. Huh? Yes, that's French then, it's Louis Vuitton. But this is actually shockingly not Fab India. But again, there is the style that we wear, the style that our politicians, that our first prime minister wore. My grandfather, when he was counting under his breath, he studied math at Cambridge, but when he was adding up, he would be counting in Farsi. It's not just about that. There is a linguistic link, there is a cultural link that goes beyond the religious link. And again, even if it was just a religious link, big deal. And if it was the case that if it was as large a proportion of Indian Muslims felt kindly towards Pakistan than as the proportion of Indian Shia do about Iran, our Pakistan policy would be bloody well different. This is what it means to be a democracy. You know, on the US, just a word, it is definitely the case that, see, the US has to be, to an extent, a world leader. So while Shimon is correct, there are other countries that have identical priorities when it comes to Iran. No other major foreign minister in the past year and a half has visited India and talked mainly about Iran. All right, but the US did. So the US has a priority here, which is fine. What is very important is to ensure that US-India relations are not seen as dependent on Iran. Okay, because that is a problem with which the US lawmakers typically tend to fall into. We have a, by and large, overstretched foreign service, but it's not overstretched in the US. I think over there we have enough clout on Capitol Hill to ensure that we do not, the India-US relationship should not be held hostage by, it's much more than whatever stance we take on Iran. Finally, it's also not true that the US is acting just like any other country when it comes to containing Iran. There has been a program, there have been assassinations of nuclear scientists, Iranian nuclear scientists, both inshore and offshore. We don't know who has done it, and I don't know who has done it, but it's probably not the Iranians, and I don't think it was the Israelis. So.
Hi, I'm Utkarsh. I'm a Young India Fellow with UPenn, and I also work here, but my question is very personal. Mihir, you said that there are linguistic ties, there are cultural ties, what you wear. One, is there a basis you say that? I mean, because foreign policy remains to be something which is governed by 700 diplomats in India. There is no poll, nothing is being asked. So is it a perception you have? That's the first part of it. The second is that although we might be linguistically and culturally associated, it could be, I do understand why you say that, but given India is a multicultural, secular, it's a democracy in every sense of the word. And do you think that our past ties are reasons enough to completely take a stance which is rooted in history and not looking forward? And the next part of my question is that you said that India cannot choose to be neutral because it's against its own strategic interest. Now, do you think that the given current geopolitical situation across the world, India should be playing the role of, say, an international, neutral, non-violent policeman trying to sort out the conflicts there? Or is it more suited in trying to play a more nuanced role and enhancing its own interest? I completely understand the point on oil, but I would like to take this discussion to a slightly different tangent, if you care. And Shimon, I have this question to you. You said that the very little can actually be done on the diplomatic level or from the state to state level, so public diplomacy becomes very important. Now, do you think that this is what you're proposing is a very long term and something which will happen in the next 50 and 100 years, and no structural change will happen without, say, an institutional change being mobilized by civil society? So, I just want your perspective on that. Is public diplomacy enough to change the structural situation?
Okay. Yeah, so there's good news and there's bad news about civil society work in international relations. The bad news is that, like you hinted, it takes time. You know, changing people's perceptions, building people-to-people relations, these things take a long while. The good news is that those changes are more permanent. They're not like an agreement between governments that overnight can be turned over. So yes, it will take longer. Like you said, 10, 15 years, 20 years. If this sort of thing keeps happening, if, you know, WhatsApp Bharat links up with an NGO in Iran of some sort or with a group of Iranians living in India and does these sort of things, it will take time to have an effect. But I think that effect will be more long-lasting and more stable.
Nothing is going to happen on the government level. There's no way civil society and government can act in conjunction on both sides.
Not in the short term.
Okay, I'll try to take your three questions turn by turn. The first is, what is my sense? I mean, do I have polling data to reflect, or is there a rational basis for the belief that many people care about what happens? I can't quote polling data. I can, however, refer you to the most granular data that is generally available, which is what people say at election rallies, what people say at in the pages of local newspapers. I don't mean big newspapers. I mean local newspapers with a 20,000 print run. That is, in fact, the most sort of granular sort of sense of opinion we have in the absence of opinion polls. And there is a very definite sense. You'd be surprised, actually, if you look at any small newspaper across North India, and particularly Urdu language newspapers, how much foreign policy there is in there. In Bengali language newspapers, you have a lot of foreign policy. I mean, even the smaller ones, and I don't mean the big ones in paradoxically out of Calcutta. You don't get that much foreign policy. They're all about Mamata. But the smaller ones are, it matters. It matters to people. And and if you look at what they actually produce, and there are a lot of institutions that will translate it for you also. In fact, my old newspaper, the Indian Express, used to run a column once a week called From the Urdu Press, which I strongly recommend you read, which was 1,200 words with an excerpts of letters, stories, editorials, and op-eds from major Urdu language newspapers, and it's fairly obvious. That being said, okay, so that's the first. The second thing is that should any kind of foreign policy be made on the basis of should it not all be forward-looking? That's absolutely correct. It should be forward-looking. However, should and politically viable are not the same thing. All right. Our many other countries should have foreign policies that are more rational than they actually are. The reason that they do not do it is because they're not politically viable for whichever country is making that foreign policy. You cannot, I think, call for in a democratic society. I have always thought that a lot of people in who study foreign policy seem to say, here at least there should be no impact of the democratic process. Why? Why is foreign policy exempt from the democratic process and nothing else is? Why is it, the energy, we will claim that the energy policy should be based on democracy. We claim that, education policy should be democratic. Any of these things has as much impact on the future as foreign policy does. Why is it that foreign policy should always be so insulated? So yes, while you are absolutely correct that some things should be forward-looking, should and can be are not the same thing. And in fact, I would argue that can be, to the extent that it includes space for the political process, the word can be is more appropriate than the word should, because the political process is what matters. And finally, is this a sort of conflict where we can create, where we can be neutral, or we can't, as I said, as of now, because of administratively. Okay, we cannot actually play a comprehensive mediatory role. All right? Which is why I said we cannot imagine a Bombay conference, which is like, come, sit down, no pork sandwiches. It's just not possible for India to do that kind of thing. That being said, it is very important. This is one of those occasions where it's very important to ensure that there is no sense, that the Iranians don't get a sense that their backs are to the wall, so they don't do anything stupid. And when those who are leading the offensive against Iran, whether, whoever it may be, do get a sense that India is not behind this 100% or even 50%. All right, so to that extent, yes, that is a sufficiently proactive role to take in this case, and if you're loud enough about it in both in both directions, you might be able to restore some sanity to the debate. Okay, on his point, on Siddharth's point about the fact that our IFS is struggling, we have, I think, the same number of foreign service officials as New Zealand. I think we have slightly more, a slightly larger worldview than New Zealand's to deal with. So.
Yeah. I just want to add. Sorry, just one quick point I wanted to add to this. So I think that's one of the reasons we're having this discussion. So someone asked us, Siddhartha asked, why foreign policy? So it's precisely because this is an issue which has much less, it needs much more importance. That connection with the people is not there. I also want to just do a small plug also, because it's not just this event. I mentioned polling, and one of the things we hope to do is figure out about issues. Now, of course, we need expertise in those issues. We can't just create polls out of nowhere. So there's a very interesting exercise that's currently underway. The Center for the Advanced Study of India, CASI, which is a big research institute at the University of Pennsylvania, led by a gentleman called Devesh Kapoor, has prepared an extremely detailed poll. In fact, I've got it here right in front of me, some 20-minute poll, extremely detailed, trying to figure out what do Indian people think about foreign policy. And I initially, as an amateur, thought this would mean things like what should be our policy in Pakistan, what should be our policy in the US. It's actually extremely nuanced and sophisticated, asking about overall worldview and exactly the kind of discourses that are happening in other foreign policy setups. So we will be actually doing this poll, initially the full poll with about 1,000 students in 10 different college campuses. This poll has been done with IAS, IFS officers, and as well as with business, with CII and FICCI, to see how do different Indian people think. So it's a small attempt to address that. And we do hope to launch this on the WhatsApp Bharat platform. And again, our philosophy is that not just to take the polling data from you, but to actually share with you the results. So it becomes an analytical platform. So we're very, very optimistic about this, actually. And as a follow-up to this exercise, in the next couple of weeks, you should be hearing more from us on that. So I just wanted to mention that. Please, sorry.
Hi there. I had a question. Now, Israel has nuclear weapons. Iran doesn't. So how does Israel have this chutzpah to, to even start this thing with Iran that they're going to destroy us when Iran is about 20 to 30 years away from nuclear power and actually should have some sort of nuclear energy as a demonstration of its scientific prowess and advancement? Secondly, isn't this warmongering, isn't this the tail wagging the dog, the United States being pushed into this war by Israel? Something like what Hitler was doing to start World War II. He started to attack Poland. He made verbal demands that you're doing this, the border incidents and all sorts of things to provoke the Second World War, which he started from Czechoslovakia. So when war becomes an option on the table, it will lead to war. And this is just enhanced and forwarded by agendas. And I feel Israel, with its 200 nuclear bombs, putting its nuclear scientists in jail, Vanunu, and having harsh military law for its minorities, discriminatory apartheid laws, is hardly a democratic country that I would say can sit down at the table with India and with its camps and detention camps in Gaza and West Bank and, have a conversation about how to treat cultural, millennial ties with other people. While Israel itself, in the last time it was created, which was, let's say, 5000 BC, it was the Iranians, King Cyrus, who sheltered the Jews. And, the Purim, the festival that all Israelis, all Jews celebrate, was because of King Cyrus's magnanimity in executing his own Balthazar, his own man, through Esther. And the Jews have forgotten that what kind of a debt they owe to Iran over 5,000 years of being saved. And the Shefadim, Israel, the Mizrahi, they all have intense debts through the Ottoman Empire, through the Arab Islamic Empire, where they were given a very sheltered, protected status. The Moroccans sheltered the Jews from Hitler, and the king told Hitler that we only have Moroccans here, didn't surrender the Moroccan Jews. Though after the Second World War, the Israeli Mossad, along with some Arab intelligence agencies, managed to provoke an Arab-Jewish conflict thereby sending a lot of the Jews back to Israel. So I see a grand machinations going on ever since the independence of Israel from 1947. It's been very active in promoting its own agendas. So-called security, Palestinians have been negated, their rights have been destroyed overshadowed by this nuclear conflict that has been generated through this Iran nuclear bogeyman. So I think it's a sideshow hiding from the real issues that plague Israel, being an unfriendly neighbor with its other neighbors.
Maybe let me just. Shimon, I'm gonna let me answer this one, so that gives a third-party perspective. For one thing, Iran is a signatory to the NPT. It's a very simple thing. Iran is a signatory to the NPT. It has voluntarily signed it, it has ratified it, and therefore it is standing in violation of that. Israel did not sign it. Now let's take the clock back further to what you're talking about with Vanunu and so on and so forth. It's very interesting. I'm just going to give you an anecdote of what exactly happened at Vanunu, and we'll take it from there. The Italian prosecutor, Domenica Silvio, who was looking into the kidnapping of Mordecai Vanunu, in his final report to the Italian government said that this was an entire elaborate hoax. Vanunu was not kidnapped by the Israelis. This is what the final report says. It was not kidnapped by the Israelis. It's an elaborate hoax which was created by Israel to showcase that the world has nuclear weapons. That's what it says. That's the final report. That's a different story altogether. The difference between Israel's suspected nuclear weapons program and the suspected Iranian nuclear program. I'm going to say suspected because for now what we know is that the IAEA has said that Iran has had facilities which it has not declared, which is supposed to under the treaties. Iran has gone ahead and pushed its enrichment facility to at 19.75%. 20% is the minimum requirement for a nuclear weapon. Iran has gone ahead and built heavy water reactors that are not used for any other purposes apart from nuclear weapons. Iran has gone ahead and done research into plutonium, which again has no other use except for nuclear weapons. It has looked into technology which it claims is for medical isotopes, the demand of which is zero in Iran and zero in the entire region. But these particular isotopes can be used in further research for nuclear weapons. And then we have the question of how the Iranians have gone ahead and threatened, as Shimon pointed out earlier, Israel, and has actually threatened not just Israel, it's also threatened Kuwait, it's threatened Azerbaijan, it's threatened other countries in the region with coups and military threats. We fear that if it does have nuclear weapons, it can actually use this as a clandestine extended nuclear deterrence for its forces such as Hezbollah. The Israelis have been among the first countries in the region to talk about a nuclear weapons-free zone. They were the ones who actually brought it up. They're the ones who bring it to the table. The Egyptians and others said that we need further information on this. The Iranians refused to talk about it. Even now, in the last NPT review conference, when the Egyptians brought it on the table, the Iranians have not been working with it. The Israelis have been working with it.
No, that's not true. The Israelis were the ones. The Israelis were the ones who were not coming to the table to talk about a nuclear-free Middle East, because they have the most to lose over there, their 200 nuclear weapons. And Vanunu is still in jail.
Hello? Yeah, so okay, on Iran and Israel, the difference between the two nuclear weapon programs, and I'm not going to pretend that they both have nuclear weapon programs. One has nuclear weapons, one does not. The reason that it's okay to an extent that Israel does not, that Israel does, and it's not okay that Iran does, is because there is an unjustness there. I recognize it, there's an injustice there, but that's an injustice that Iran signed up to. If Iran wanted to eventually have a nuclear weapons program, it should not have signed the non-proliferation treaty, the NPT. And if you break a treaty, you will pay the consequences. And Iran is seeing that right now. There is absolutely there is no two ways about that.
But I think we are all signatories, even India and Pakistan.
India is not
Okay.
India is not a signatory. Pakistan is not a signatory. Israel is not a signatory. Okay, so I mean, you break an international treaty, there will be consequences. Yeah. And finally, on this whole question of the whether or not Israelis should be grateful to Iran for stuff, or to the Persians, Um, it's everyone remembers the recent past more, and I remember that after the Iranian Revolution, they strung up and hung 400 innocent Jews. I think 400. How many is it? 400 or 500 innocent Jews, saying that they were spying for Israel. People whose families had lived there forever. They persecuted a minority. All right. So there is no gratitude that anyone is going to feel to that regime. It is just not going to happen. If you think that is going to happen, you're mistaken.
I just want to say one thing. So look, I actually am sympathetic to your perspective from the sense that, let's just get really fundamental here. Growing up as a liberal, as a social activist, from an emotional perspective, certainly, right? This question of injustice. Does India deserve to have nuclear weapons? I'm an Indian citizen, so why not as an Iranian? And it's not just the point about the NPT is what I wanted to say. I don't buy that argument that they signed it. So yes, legally it's an argument. Emotionally, it's not an argument. Say, who cares about the legal stuff, right? But the real argument is what they said about the regime, right? That Israel is feeling threatened, from its formation, so it's having nuclear weapons to protect itself. I'm not sure if Israel has an explicit no first use policy. Iran, on the other hand, as a regime, even if you support the Iranian civilization, the people, the rights, we're not talking about the larger, Jewish, Islamic issues and so on and so forth. There's a lot of aspects to what you said. But just on the aspect of owning nuclear weapons, that regime has explicitly said, or at least some aspects of it, their prime minister or the president has said that, hey, I will use this and I'll create a global holocaust and so on. So I think it's from that perspective that most people feel that, but I think the point is still a valid one with respect to, which I'm curious about, if I can focus the question on that to Shimon, is on Israel's nuclear stockpile and issues like, well, do you agree with that it's basically there for self-defense? Why is it such a secret? And, and that question of that injustice, which is perceived between Israel having nuclear weapons and Iran wanting them.
First, I'd like to respond to your name? Seth. Okay. So 3 things. First of all, you said the Jews have forgotten everything the Persians did for them. Well, this Jew didn't forget. In fact, this Jew started his presentation with saying, that we remember how much we owe King Cyrus the Great. That's just to get that clear. The second thing, there's the warmongering point. I at no point in my presentation said that war would be a lovely thing. I think war would be catastrophic. I think that a war when Iran has nuclear weapons will be more catastrophic than a war when Iran does not yet have nuclear weapons. But in either case, a war will be a terrible thing. So you'll never see me saying, we want war, it's a good thing. And the third thing, I just want to add up on something that Siddharth and Mihir and Kartik said, that no one kicked up a fuss. India is also a non-signatory to the NPT. I wouldn't say that no one kicked up a fuss, but it wasn't an international crisis when India declared that it was going for nuclear weapons. And I think a key difference is that it's a different kind of regime. Okay? Imagine if Syria today had nuclear weapons. Let's not talk about Syria. Let's talk about Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad is fighting for his life. His whole country is rising up against him. He has nothing to lose. Imagine if he had access to the red button. And according to foreign reports, had a certain country not done a certain thing, he would indeed have that red button. Think how his own people would feel. His own people would not dare to rise up because they would know the damage he's capable of creating. Okay, and now what Kartik asked about. Yeah, so let's first of all be clear on what Israel's policy is. Our policy is something similar in a sense to the no first use. What we have said repeatedly is that Israel will not be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East. Of which an implication of that is no first use. Okay? And then you can ask about what we call the opacity policy, which is we don't say, like the first rule about Fight Club is you don't talk about the Fight Club. So our first rule about our nuclear capabilities or lack thereof is that we don't talk about them. Now that may seem a bit silly, either you have it or you don't, just be. But whether we have it or we don't, the more responsible thing would be not to talk about it. Because you have 4 options here. Either we have nuclear weapons and we confirm that we do, we have nuclear weapons and we deny. We don't have nuclear weapons and we confirm that we do. We don't have nuclear weapons and we deny. Okay? First, if we have and we confirm, then that ratchets up the pressure all around the region, because that becomes a threat. Okay? Bad policy. If we have and we deny, then we encourage all those countries who, as I said, are committed to our destruction. Because then they say, Israel is weaker than a spider web, as Ahmadinejad said, and therefore we can sweep them aside, and that encouraged them to attack. Don't have and confirm, again. A, you're bluffing. B, you're ratcheting up the tension and pushing the region closer to war. Bad. Don't have and deny, again, it's... I believe we won't be believed if we say that. So A, whether we have or we look, we will be less credible. We will be less credible. B, you're encouraging countries that want to threaten you. So, but it's good to see that we have a very well-informed audience, nonetheless.
Yeah, and the main thing is to avoid this war, and it would just be a lot clearer if people respected the other countries and, just had sort of an opinion of actually seeing what it is. Now, Dagan, who was the intelligence chief of Israel, he's been quoted widely here, he actually said Ahmadinejad has been misquoted. He actually never said that he wants the annihilation of the Jewish race or Israel. All he said was that do not fear Israel. It's as weak as a spider web. So he's playing to his people, his politics, of course, and he's talking to his audiences. And it's being mistranslated all around the world, leading to different impressions and leading up to a case for war. As we've seen, the entire war in Iraq was based on a lie. WMDs were lies. Almost everything that in Afghanistan we were fighting for was a lie. It was solved in Pakistan, the problem of bin Laden. So almost everything that thousands of soldiers, US Christian soldiers have been dying for, thousands, hundreds of thousands of Muslim civilians dying, Arab civilians, have been over lies. So should we continue this case for war and not look deeper, slow down, and have warmongering prime ministers, especially like Netanyahu, and now in the government, Shaul Mofaz, very warlike, hawk-like Iraqi. He himself is an Iraqi. His policies are very hawkish, and I think these two together with Ehud Barak will push for war. And even though you are very moderate, and most Israelis, civilians are moderate, but you have a government which is very, very right-wing. Lieberman, Shaul Mofaz, Netanyahu, the bad guys of Israel. They're pushing America into war also now. So what do we do about that?
So one of you made a statement that foreign policy of a country depends on the emotions and the feelings of the citizens of that country, what shared interests they have, what shared history they have. But we just saw a video, and we were also told that a similar video is there for Iranians as well, where they declare their love for each other. But still there are hostile relations between Iran and Israel. And moreover, when we say that most Indian Muslims do not feel in a good way about the Pakistani Muslims, aren't we being prejudiced? Because all the Muslims in Pakistan aren't the ones who are terrorists. It's just a small section of them, or maybe those people don't even hail from Pakistan. They're from different parts of the world and they're just residing in Pakistan. So isn't that prejudice when we talk about that? And isn't geopolitics more about other things than just common feelings, sentiments, and a shared culture? Thank you.
It absolutely is. But it is one important input into foreign policy is to what degree you feel a closeness to the country being discussed. All right, there is, that's just how some of there's absolutely no reason to suppose that the United States and the United Kingdom have as many similar interests as for them to have had an alliance that has fought now 4 wars, by itself practically. It's there are ways in which you feel, or which your population in a democratic society has an emotional attachment to one country or another country that does impact what people seeking votes from them expect. Right? And that is the case all over the world, in every single democratic society. That is, whether that is the only input into foreign policy, of course not. Because, you know, what people believe is not the any input into any kind of policy. It's not the only input into any kind of policy. I may believe that you can, you know, we should all be able to get energy from water, but we can't get energy from water yet, and so it's not going to enter my energy policy. However, if I believe it strongly enough and enough people believe it, then the government will announce a project to analyze whether or not we can get energy from water. You know, so there are ways in which it is an important input into any kind of policy making in a democratic society, but it's not the only input. Now, about my, you know, whether we're prejudiced about Pakistani Muslims, I don't think that anybody is prejudiced about Pakistani. That's not what I was saying. What I was saying was, do we feel that we have a particular kind of civilizational link? Yes, but it's not a positive emotion that's felt by most of us. And if I may say so, it's not a positive emotion, particularly for most Indian Muslims. As in, you know, yeah, it's just not. It's not the same thing. Yeah.
So to this, I would like to add: isn't that negative feeling towards Pakistani Muslims because of our foreign policy and not vice versa? It's because that's what has been portrayed to us since the very beginning. That Pakistan.
Well, that's a tougher question than I can. Yeah, it's a good question, but I think that would be sort of. You'd have to go back and forth. So I don't know if I'll be able to.
I want to hit at the root of the problem. Why is there so much hatred towards the Jews?
This is just my personal view. I think in different periods of history, there have been different reasons in different places. And I think if you can find any sort of pattern, it's that we're something always radically different from our environment. Okay, the Jews in Europe were something radically different from the Christian society around them. The Jews in Muslim countries are radically different from the Muslims around them. And the state of Israel is radically different from the countries that surround it. So that's the only sort of common pattern, but the truth is a lot more complex, and you have to look at every period and every instance. Yeah. So, but it's a good question.
Is that by any chance driven by the religions? So we haven't yet discussed the role of religion of Islam and Judaism and Christianity. Because whatever I have read about all this is, I think that's actually the root. So whether religion is being used as a pawn in this entire complex issue, or is religion the trigger? I'm like, that's something which I would like to hear from, each one of you, given that you will be able to share the angle of being one of the two religions, while they can bring in the second or third perspective. I've always believed it's a religious issue, but yeah.
I wouldn't say it's mainly religious, because Islam and Judaism are actually very, very close in theology and even in practice. But it's definitely, like you say, part of it. But we're different in other ways as well, other than religion. And in fact, if you look at Europe, that there was a time when Jews thought, oh, I'll let go of my Jewish religion, and I'll become Christian, and I'll, cut myself up for my tradition, and then the people around me will like me. And that didn't work. So it's not just religion.
I just have a very quick comment, and if people, sorry, did you want to answer? Want to respond, that's fine. But I think it's very interesting that women's voices have not been included quite literally in the panel, and then also as a wider voice in this discussion. And I'm not just sort of saying this as a knee-jerk thing. 3 women won the Nobel Peace Prize this year for their contributions to peace and diplomacy. Women's bodies have been huge symbols of social change in Iran, as have their voices. And I just think that it's an important part of the conversation that hasn't really been addressed here today, and that should be something that we talk about more as we continue this conversation in the future.
Right. If I may respond to you first, I think that typically when, at points when there is a drumbeat to war, it appears women's voices get silenced more strongly. That is just something that I observed in the US between 2000 and 2003. It just seemed that there were fewer female faces on television suddenly. when war was, when it seemed that war was likely. And I can't give you an explanation for that, but that is something that I have observed. On the role of religion, I think Shimon made a valid point about the fact that there are people in the Iranian leadership who are millennialist, as in they believe, they genuinely do. I don't think the supreme leader himself is like that, but it's possible that Mr. Ahmadinejad is, and to what degree he is still powerful. And so yes, there is an element of millennialism. There's an element of which causes people sometimes to be slightly irrational. But on the other hand, I can say that there has been an element in millennialism in North American Protestant Christianity for 70 years, and by and large, they've still managed to get, be not completely irresponsible state. So I would not overplay the actual religious problems here. I would not underplay the ethnic aspects to it, but I would not turn to the actual sort of doctrinal aspects of the religion for anything.
I would like to add one more thing. Is there is an imminent regime change that we could hope for in Iran with the supreme leader, problems between Ahmadinejad and the supreme leader, and a lot of things are happening. So could any of you throw some light on that? Like, could we see some light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, when you say light at the end of the tunnel, like what kind of light are we looking at?
The light could be that the Iranian regime itself, there is a shift.
Well, it's very difficult to really put it in terms of how it impacts the present context of Israel and Iran relations, because this hostility has been going on for more than 3 decades. It's been going on since the 1979 revolution, and it's just been increasing in tempo. It ties into the earlier question when it comes to religion, for example. It's moved beyond the nationalistic trend of Iran versus Israel. I mean, you have statements from the Iranian leadership which said something to the effect of, it's good all the Jews of the world are congregating in one place so we can wipe them all out. So it's not talking about a nationality here. We're talking about a religious genocide. We're actually calling for the death of a particular cultural group, a community as a whole. So, but then again, tying into your question about where is it moving from here, even if you do have somebody like Khatami, who is seen to be more moderate than Ahmadinejad, I think the wheels of motion for the nuclear program has gone to a stage where it's become a matter of pride for them. You see the fact that a number of their scientists have been killed. You see the setbacks which have come about because of the Stuxnet attack. You see their own internal pride, which comes out in the editorials in Iran. Not a single editorial in the Iranian newspaper looks at why is Iran going for the nuclear program when it does have its own energy-rich resources. Every one of the editorials looks at promoting it as a sense of pride for them, and I don't think it's possible for any newcomer to go back on that. They might be a bit more pragmatic when it comes to negotiations with the West, and I think that's very much possible because of the developments in Afghanistan. I do believe that the Iranians and the Americans will, just like the Americans negotiating the Taliban in the back door, I'm sure somewhere down the line we'll have a negotiation with Iran as well. But when it comes to the nuclear question, I think it's far more difficult for them to really go back on it, but I see some progress. It's a 2-step forward, 1-step backward approach when it comes to that. So I hope that answers your question.
Hi, my name is Suchita, and this is just a quick comment on the discussion. Taking on from the point that you raised, I think it's important to give cognizance to the fact that there are 2 distinct things we're talking about here. One is people and second is politics. And both of them, while there is a symbiotic, mutual give-and-take relationship from them, they function as different entities. So as people, you as an Israeli may say that, yes, we should love Iran and we don't want to bomb Iran, but the politics of it might transcend into something completely different. But I think where the discussion comes in and where the discussion becomes significant is what do we, as India, the people, and India, the politics, what do we bring to the forefront? And to that, I just have to say I completely agree with Mihir that I think it's important for us, especially when the world's eyes are on us and when we have a stake in this relationship between Iran and Israel. We don't buckle down and stay quiet and do nothing about it as usual, but we do take a stand because one, it does affect us, and two, I think more than anything, it's high time we raise our voice to something.
So that's a wonderful, actually, summation. So I don't have to do it. And thank you very much for that and all the other comments. And I just wanted to say two quick points just to respond. One was on this millennialism, and we're talking about religious extremism. And the only thing I'll say is, again, this is my personal view, I think religious extremists are the same in all societies, right? So we had during the Iraq war lead up, I personally attribute that also to millennialism in the President of the United States and his closest advisors who have certain religious beliefs that the rapture is coming or whatever. And I'm sure leaders potentially in both Iran and Israel potentially have those kind of religious fervor. So that should not be really driving politics. And the essential point is politics and people are different. So we have to separate that out. And of course, the comment that was made about the role of women, also that's a very good point. We totally accept that. And that's a good comment that you made. In fact, we had other panelists also, some of them who couldn't come. And we did think about this. And in fact, we were joking about it with Devesh Kapoor and Rohan yesterday. Not joking, but kind of they were lamenting it, that there are very few women, sadly, in security and foreign policy. We were looking at the poll, the foreign policy poll, something like 80% of the respondents, including in IFS, IAS, business, they're all men. It's only when we're doing the poll with youth that you're getting 80% female participation. So that's a very important issue. And I'm sorry I missed part of that discussion, but definitely I think the role of women getting involved in this, that actually probably will make some of these issues hopefully more sane and more balanced going forward. So I actually see that as a very critical issue. That partly because it's been such a male-dominated discussion and politics and so on, there's more focus on war and ego and stuff like that. And especially if you're talking about, I mean, we've seen this in the development. Why are microfinance loans given to women versus to men, right? Because they'll use them for more productive purposes. So it's a very, very interesting question, and I think that's something we should all kind of think about and get more women, involved in the discussion as we go forward. So with that, again, I would like to thank all of our three speakers. And we're running about 10 minutes late, but the real sort of the highlight of this show is about to begin.